Maybe unmute. Ok, va benissimo pure, guardate.
Okay. Sì. Basta, annulliamo questo computer.
Perfetto.
Sempre però le cose prima di togliere.
No, però togli solo lo zoom. Togli solo lo zoom. Però qualcuno mi avvicina a me, non so perché mi è stato solo. Perfetto. Però ci avviciniamo tutti. Ok, qua. Ok, so we solved it.
Yes.
Fantastic. Bene, vi accanto? No, sì, esatto. Okay. E poi arriverà Lorenzo, quindi facciamoci e poi ci organizzeremo. Passiamo, accendiamo la luce di più forse perché non si sente nulla.
Penso lasciamo stare. Contiamo in questo.
Ok.
Vabbè, siamo abbastanza illuminati.
Thank you so much. L'hai messo now I think everything is okay. Right?
Giusto,
Hi.
ragazzi.
Okay. Hello everyone, thank you to be here. Che non l'hai fatto? Non si sente adesso?
Prima.
Thank you. Hi Younes. Hi Marco. So thank you so much to be here for the SIS Seminar 3 and sorry.
I think you might be muted, Francesca.
Non si sente. No, deve togliere il muto. Caitlin, I think she's on mute.
Yeah, I think it's odd though because it doesn't say.
Yeah, no, she's on mute.
She's on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, now it is better.
Okay.
Ok, guarda, grazie mille, per piacere dello schermo, no, ma per piacere. Okay. Grazie mille. Sorry for these technical problems. So thank you to be here. Thank you, Julia, for the technical assistance. So welcome to SIS Seminar 3. Today we are speaking about, we will talk about a question of organizing during this pandemic, so what can be the lessons for the left? So what can we learn about what is actually happening? We are connecting from Palermo, from SIS Salon in Palermo, Sicily, Italy. The seminar is introduced and organized and will be moderated by Caitlin Peters, PhD candidate at York University in Toronto. Caitlin is also SIS Politics Emancipation Fellow. We have a set of questions, then I will give the word to Caitlin. No, we have a lot of guests, so I want to welcome first Jade Da Costa, coordinator and co-founder of the People's Pantry in Toronto. She will talk and she will explain to us what have you been doing. Complimenti for your great work. We have Luca Cinquemani, researcher and activist from Palermo. Marcela Caldas, also researcher and activist from Palermo. We have Incosilati Manuel Moyo, who maybe can will be able to join us in a little while. Also, Lorenzo Marsili, philosopher, activist, and social entrepreneur, who will join us, who is coming now from between one call and another. And Leslie J. Wood, professor of sociology. Welcome at York University and editor of the journal Interface, a journal for and about social movements. So I will give the mic to Caitlin so she can introduce the questions we thought about to ask ourselves in this context. Thank you very much for this great organization. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you. French, can you guys hear me just to ask? Yeah? Okay, so thank you so much everybody for coming out. Again, just let me introduce myself really shortly. I'm a PhD candidate at York University in Toronto, Canada, SIS Politics of Emancipation Fellow, and occasional labor organizer. I would have actually been in Sicily right now if not for the pandemic. That's okay though. But since I don't get to do that, this is the next best thing. So the broad theme of this seminar is leftist organizing during a pandemic, which will include things like the constraints and opportunities for activists and organizers during this time, the form and function of organizing right now, and even the ingenuity and the strategic subversion of organizers who are providing us with lessons for the future. So I will technically be co-hosting alongside Nicholas Lathi, who is an activist from Zimbabwe. He's having some technical issues right now. In addition to issues sending a recorded file that he was going to let us hear. So hopefully we can get that before the seminar is over and we can hear it, because he does provide a really interesting perspective on organizing in the developing context, specifically in Zimbabwe.
He's here, he just came.
Oh, he came? Oh, that's awesome.
Just connected.
Okay, perfect. I don't see him on my participants. Okay.
Good evening, Cole.
Okay. So what I'll say how to structure the seminar. It'll be formal / informal, I suppose you could say. So after I provide some context on the conditions we're facing right now, we'll have Professor Leslie Wood introduce our featured reading for today and her perspective on what it means to organize during a pandemic. And then we'll have our activist speakers introduce themselves and the work that they're involved with right now. And I'll just ask them a couple of key questions to get things started, and then we'll just open it up for everybody. As for activist introduction, so I have on the roster already, I have Lorenzo Marsili, Luca Cinquemani, and Jay DaCosta. But if you're an activist and you come last minute and you're involved in something right now, just pop your name into the chat box with your organization or what you're doing right now, and then I can know to introduce you when we come to the activist component, because this is a good opportunity and we'd like to get as many voices in the discussion as we can. So if you've come last minute, just introduce yourself in the chat box. Yes, perfect. Awesome. So to provide some context to this seminar, what I'll say is, this moment feels near apocalyptic. Seeming to herald this monumental shift that will change the way we live and organize forever. So the ongoing pandemic is leaving hundreds of thousands of casualties in its wake, with these deaths not equitably distributed across the population. People in developing countries who lack critical healthcare infrastructure are more at risk of dying from complications. Frontline workers, many of whom are women, are at the forefront of this pandemic, often lacking proper equipment to protect themselves. And impoverished communities, migrants without papers, and racialized communities in the developed world are more likely to die due to lack of access to healthcare and discrimination. In this context, we're also seeing the rise of anti-racist movements and Black Lives Matter movements across the globe. So what does it mean to organize in this context? And we're confronted by a number of barriers and maybe even one or two opportunities. In terms of barriers, and something we talked about during the last SIS seminar, was the rise of an opportunistic authoritarian state that is using the pandemic as a doorway to erode democratic processes and norms by imposing a state of emergency that has given a number of governments the ability to crack down on free speech and restrict people's right to collective assembly, while allowing the executive to bypass the will of the Constitutional Assembly, as has been in the case in Hungary, Egypt, Brazil, Georgia, China, Kazakhstan, amongst a number of others. Even in Canada, our own Prime Minister attempted to pass a piece of legislation that would have allowed his government to tax and spend without the approval of Parliament until December 21st, 2021. So for activists, these kinds of state movements are translating into more surveillance and less freedom. At the same time, we have to consider what does it mean to mobilize in the face of healthcare and protective equipment shortages while risking infection and death. This is something that activists are now actively confronting. How do we navigate these barriers? As an opportunity, some have said, though, that COVID could act like maybe an event that incites a mass change in public consciousness that not only contests systemic inequalities related to race, but also neoliberalism in general, and the common sense notion that responsible governance means balancing budgets through the use of cuts, especially to healthcare. When governments are against defunding police, but clearly have no issues defunding literally everything else, it forces one to stop and consider who the state is serving and for what ends. So based on this context, what are people doing right now to organize and resist? So in the article assigned by, that we've assigned by Professor Wood, she talks about some of these important formations, including mutual aid networks and caremongering, in-person protests by anti-racist activists and by essential workers. So ultimately, it is these forms of protests that will attempt to beat back a state intent on protecting a flailing capitalism on the backs of its most vulnerable citizens, which is why these discussions can be so important and informative, because this can become a place where we can exchange information to create a better set of best practices that can be used, that can more effectively resist power while protecting vulnerable communities during a time of crisis. So at this point, what I'd like to do, actually I was gonna say, before I pass it along to Leslie, I was wondering, Nkosi, can you hear us? Is it possible if you'd like to do your introductions too?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me there?
Yes, we can. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Inia. I'm speaking. Okay, Inia, I'm speaking from you. I'm speaking to you from Zimbabwe, right here in Southern Africa. I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation.
Sorry?
Is everyone hearing me there?
Yes, Lorenzo just arrived. Please, Lorenzo, have a seat.
Hello, good evening. Sorry for being late. I just got out of an endless call.
We have to enter in the video because otherwise, no. Okay.
Okay. Can I proceed?
Ok. Ma perché mi avete avanti? No, perché così è una distribuzione. Yes, please, go on.
Thank you very much. So I was actually introducing myself. My name is Nkosilati Emmanuel Senior. I'm a human rights defender. I'm a pro-democracy campaigner and a political activist, speaking to you from Zimbabwe, right here in Southern Africa. Allow me to thank all this great team at SIS for putting up this discussion here. I'm also a grateful recipient of the SIS Politics of Emancipation Scholarship. So going straight to the point and the discussion that we have tonight, this discussion about the left organizing under this pandemic comes at a time that is very critical, that is very crucial, right here in Southern Africa. You know, Africa is big. We have 55 countries, maybe 54 if you ask Morocco. But we are dealing with different forms of dictatorships. But all in all of them trampling on the rights of their own people. So organizing under such a pandemic, maybe we need to look at the situation, the pre-pandemic situation. The space was shrinking, the civic space was on the brink, and of a total shutdown, of a total collapse. But now with the coming in of the COVID-19 exacerbated the situation. Now we have a situation whereby any form of organizing is hindered, prohibited, or brutally or heavy-handedly responded to, all in the guise of handling the pandemic. To say you cannot gather, you cannot go and present this petition. We have COVID-19, we have this pandemic. You cannot do this, we cannot do that. This is, in my view, a gift to dictators to consolidate their power. So we, the left, you are now trying to navigate and find ways of circumventing the barriers that they've put in front of us. Right here, someone has mentioned the issue of access to essential services, healthcare, you know, issues to do with that. Talk of Zimbabwe, we have a dysfunctional healthcare, mounting economic woes. The healthcare that we have here, for lack of a better word, allow me to say it is rotten. There, even before this pandemic, there was shortage of essential drugs. People couldn't access essential drugs. And we have a government which then prioritizes, you know, the interest, the extravagant interest of the elites. They fly to Dubai, that's where they do their shopping. If they get sick, they are treated in Singapore. They go everywhere, they go this and that. But the majority in Zimbabwe, you know, the funny part of it is our own government does not trust in its own healthcare. If their children and themselves are sick, they don't get treated in Zimbabwe. They are treated outside Zimbabwe because they don't even trust in the healthcare they built themselves. So you see where the problem emanates from now. Now the coming in of the COVID-19 on such a healthcare which is already dead, it's transiting from bad to worse. So we have been organizing, mobilizing, trying to challenge all these forms, you know, of authoritarianism. You know, there are protests, like I'll give you for an example, a protest which took place on 9 June. Young people, young sons and daughters of Zimbabwe took to the streets to challenge how the government of Zimbabwe is managing or is handling the COVID-19 pandemic. The government responded brutally and heavy-handedly. The organizers of that protest were 3 young ladies who, sorry, is everyone still hearing me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. The organizers of those protests, the 3 young women, namely Nesai Marova, Joanna Mamombe, Cecilia Chimbiri, were arrested. This is on the 9th of June, right here in 2020. And right now, as I speak, they are being kept at Shikurubi Maximum Prison. That's the prison where hardcore criminals in the Republic of Zimbabwe are kept. Their crime was just to organize, to mobilize, and to ask the government to demand the public accountability on the handling of this pandemic. So this clearly brings us to the point that right here in sub-Saharan Africa, Zimbabwe in particular, organizing such a pandemic under such a pandemic is becoming very, very, very difficult, risky, and dangerous because you are dealing with the typical tyrannical regimes. It's better in our neighboring countries. In South Africa, there's a certain level of caution. The government respects, to some extent, fundamental freedoms there. So people can ask the government what's happening under this pandemic, this and that, public accountability, maybe this officer is not doing this not doing that. To some extent, there's some fundamental freedoms. Like what I said earlier on, that Africa is not all the same. But here in Zimbabwe, it's brutal, and to some extent, it is worse. So now that physical gathering is now difficult to say we can organize a protest, to present this petition, to present that. I envy when I see Black Lives Movement on TV, you know, when they are protesting against, you know, racism, you know, the killing of George Floyd. You know, I really envy that. I really admire that. In my country, if you are just 10 and we are trying to protest, we're trying to be on the street, the whole army is on us, they can even open fire, they can even kill some people. So I really envy the organizing and the mobilization that is over there. So now, let me speak for the next 2 minutes to say, what then is the way forward? For me, I'm thinking that right now we are trying to embrace social media as another mobilization and organizing tool. In as much as that could also be difficult considering the cost of that was right here in Zimbabwe. Like, it's not like in Europe where everybody or almost everyone can access internet. Here we have to pay a certain amount to access those internet bundles, and to some extent access to internet is becoming a privilege. The elites, the political elites, are making it difficult because they know that that's the alternative that we are left with to organize and mobilize ourselves. So they are making it difficult again in that arena. But we're just trying to then try to find ourselves and organize ourselves even through social media, challenge all these forms of authoritarianism, challenge all forms of the government's failure to deliver and raise the issues of how best our people can access essential services. I call upon all of us here, especially through the platforms that we have, like here, to say, if there's something which must unite the world, it must be this COVID-19 pandemic. We need international solidarity. We need the platforms like this one to tell our story. They can block us right here in Zimbabwe through state media, through all their censorship. But through platforms like this one, I'm taking it as an opportunity for us to tell our story, where they cannot censor us, where they cannot kind of monitor us or force us to say what we don't want to say. So we need international solidarity. Yes, we have diagnosed the problem, but now the solutions or the ways of trying to circumvent or navigate it, we now need global unity to do with this. So I'm trying to run very, very fast because of time, but I'm available for further explanation, for further clarification, or if anyone needs more information about the challenges you are facing here. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Nkosi. That was amazing. And thank you for framing our debate to ensure that it contextualizes and relates to mobilizations that are happening in the developed context in relation to what's happening in the developing world as well. So at this point, I will pass it along to Leslie, who is the author of our reading today. And especially relevant in that it goes over and frames some of the mobilizations that are happening right now during the pandemic and hope for the future.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for inviting me, Caitlin. Thank you, Francesca, for organizing this thing. So nice to see everybody. I want to, and thanks for reading the piece. It was, obviously we're in a moment where we're trying to think hard about what the hell is going on. And this piece was written in April and things have changed. So I'm going to try and say a little bit about the piece and extend it a little bit into the future, or into the present rather, because yeah, things are very much in flux. And I'm talking primarily about what's happening in Toronto, in Canada, and a little bit of attention to the US, because we have being next to the US, we hear a lot about the US, but I also have a lot of networks and activist comrades there. And I also, I think Nkosi Salathi is right. This is a moment for internationalism. I know Caitlin shared the interface journal that I work with, and we put out a call for stories about organizing in the COVID crisis, and we were totally overwhelmed, right? So we, at 30 pieces, which we put out over a couple of weeks, well, 3 weeks, I think, we had to stop because it was so labor intensive to do that. But of course, as soon as we stopped, it seems like the things that we needed to think about and strategize about and hear about had increased. And of course, we're not hearing from all the movements in all parts of the world. Indeed, there was a disproportionate number from Europe and North America, and less from Africa and Latin America. And I think we need to be paying real attention to what's going on in these different spaces. The piece basically argues that social movements save lives, right? That they're essential services and that they're critical in this moment in which political relationships are reconfiguring themselves, but that there are risks within them, right? That the scale of the crisis pushes people toward the state often. Essential workers need protection and wages and paid sick leave and from their employers, and social movements often come in the form of making demands. What do we want and when do we want it, right? And that pushes us there. And that may, paradoxically, one of the things I wanted to point out, strengthen the system that helps to recreate racial, class, and other inequalities. So what do we do? How can we build towards a more just, fruitful world without facilitating increasing authoritarianism and exclusion, both now and in the long haul? And I think that sounds like one of the paradoxes you guys were talking about last week, because we're not all in this together. things are playing out differently. My sense is that there's been 3 chapters in the, I mean, and we can argue about number of chapters, it doesn't really matter, but there's been different chapters in organizing in the COVID moment. The first was a period of, lockdown and survival. So mutual aid, workers' action, prisoners' action of like, holy crap, we're gonna die here if we don't actually do something. The second was the left infrastructure started to mobilize. I'm talking about Canada and the US particularly, but started to step up, demand more benefits, demand support, demand certainty. And then the third, which is what we're in right now, I think in terms of the wave of protest that's emerged around Black lives and racist policing, is a period of reemergence and experimentation that is building off of, transcending, but learning from the previous periods. And so I think that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it right now. I think we can understand these different chapters by using what we know about movement emergence, right? That movements tend to emerge in periods of uncertainty. And the COVID is definitely a period of uncertainty. That periods of uncertainty, COVID, like sometimes economic crises and wars, can disrupt relationships amongst elites, right? Provide opportunities for movements to push for demands that they've often been working for a long time. It creates a crisis of legitimacy for elites in how to handle that, which helps to create those tensions amongst those different players. In some cases, states care less in authoritarian regimes about legitimacy. They have force, right? But in cases where there is more of a rhetoric of consent and that sort of thing, relationships, that is where the opportunity comes from. There's changes to the state and the economy right now, obviously. Massive layoffs, 35 million layoffs in the US, shutting down of borders, and that plays out, as well as the disruption of routine grassroots relationships amongst people, right? So all of this kind of can be looked at through like, what's the relationship between the regime and the repertoire? And that's often a state-based analysis, but we can look at it locally, we can look at it internationally and think about that dialectic. So those kind of tools orient my thinking around these 3 chapters. And at the beginning, but at all stages, I would say that there's some things that are happening because of just the particular features of this kind of crisis, that social ties become more dependent on strong ties, right? When we're locked down, we are in contact with people we're already in contact with, which often reproduces inequalities. That there's an increased localization of activity and of connection, right? Tied to that strong tie relationship, that we have an increased dependence on electronic communication and networks, which also has within it inequalities, but also opportunities, right? And since George Floyd and this reemergent wave of protest, we see a wave of new mobilization, new activists into the street, but not everyone, right? And not everybody can go. Okay. So in the beginning, I think the movements I work with, we were really trying to follow the lead of folks who are most vulnerable, right? So the immunocompromised, the undocumented, the hopeless. And we wanted to make sure that whatever strategy we took next kept those folks who are most vulnerable at the center. So that we kind of moved to really kind of make that very central. I don't want to say too much about this because it's in the article, but we wanted to defend the needs of workers. We wanted to demand state support for the most marginalized. Wanted to disrupt exploitation and opportunity hoarding, and we wanted to provide direct support and mutual aid, and those things are continuing. There was a tension there, as I've mentioned, between the things that ask the state to step up, which then increase support for and trust in government. There is an increase in popular support for government in Canada and all the way through right now, despite the fact that not everybody is supported, and that ended up creating a situation where governments felt emboldened to do things like say, you have to show your ID if you're out in the streets, right? Right now, on the basis of the risk around COVID. There were some, though, important victories. There was important like huge numbers of people were released from prisons, calling into question the need to imprison people. Immigrant detainees were released. We were able and continue to be able to get rooms for homeless folks, even though every time the state would say it was going to do it, we'd have to push harder and harder. And so there's still a lot of incredible organizing that's happening. The quick success reassures the public, but it's often a PR move if it's not continued to push. So there's been, I'm not going to say too much more about some of those methods because I know I don't want to take up too much time, but I think that we're in this new stage right now that's building on the learning from this, right? So in some ways, this new stage of mobilization, and it is intense in Toronto right now. It's a protest almost every day, sometimes more than one, around Black lives. Although we are doing it differently, and this relates to some of the questions. So one of the things we were doing on Friday was marking out X's every 6 feet. Everybody could sit on their X. We have everybody wearing masks. We're handing out masks. We're making sure people have PPE. We are communicating do a lot of marshalling and in ways that is much more intensive than I have ever seen, like a 3-page document of scripts of how to engage. And partly this is because of distrust in these movements, because these movements are emerging quite quickly and people don't know each other. And there's a real concern because of histories of anti-Black racism that the center, the Black leadership of these movements is going to get overwhelmed by other folks and Indigenous leadership right now. So there's a real concern that the logic of keeping the most vulnerable at the center is being lost in this massive wave of protest, right? But the mutual aid and some of the creative thinking that has been happening over the last few months, I think is allowing us to think really beyond the traditional social movements. So this weekend I was at an incredible panel of thinking alternatives to policing. And there were probably close to 100 people, there were hundreds of people watching it, discussing, okay, so what does it mean to actually make our society in a way that is just, that puts people's needs at the center, that thinks about security on the basis of protecting the most vulnerable. And this is learning that I think has got a new resonance during the period of COVID, because we've realized, I mean, we maybe knew already, but I think more and more people have realized that if you don't take care of the most vulnerable, the whole society is at risk, right? And so some of the work that Jade's been doing, I mean, I think has really helped to also kind of build that understanding of that it's not utopian. It's not, you know, out of the imaginary. This is something that we do and we can do together. And we don't have to say, okay, what, you know, we need the police. Somebody said to me the other day, which I think was very smart, when we talk about, it's not about alternatives to policing because police weren't making us safer in the first place. Let's think about how can we make a society that is what we want. And so I think this kind of political opportunity, I know that language is often quite sort of reductionist and structural, but I think the political opportunity that is happening right now is because of the uncertainty, people are willing to think beyond the space and time that we're in. And that even though this has been and continues to be a horrendous thing that's killing, you know, almost 500,000 people, we realize that the status quo isn't working, and that if we pay attention, we realize that it's possible to create another world. But we do need to continue to be vigilant about recognizing the ways that that imagining keeps kind of trapping us within existing racial and class hierarchies. So I think I kind of went a little bit beyond my notes, but how's that? Okay?
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Leslie. That's awesome. Okay, perfect. That's awesome. That's a great way to preface this next stage of the seminar. So I was hoping at this point, I've had 3 activists on the roster. If you're not, then you can still feel free to chime in here anyway. But I thought at this point we could talk about what some people are doing right now to organize during COVID. So I've got Lorenzo Marsili, organizer, philosopher from Palermo, Luca Cinquemani, activist researcher from Palermo, and then Jay DaCosta, coordinator and co-founder of the People's Pantry. So I was, I don't know if Lorenzo, I think if you're here, oh, perfect. Would you mind, so at this stage, would you mind just kind of talking about, introduce yourself, what forms of activism you're involved in, who you're serving, and how they've been impacted during the pandemic? I'll put my little question in the chat box if you need to refer to it.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I think there is an echo. Why is there an echo? Because
let's mute something. Let's mute here. Just do the opposite.
No, it's better if this microphone is on, because we have two computers in the same room.
Ma non vorrei che quello lo registrasse.
Ah, perché quello registra, certo.
Perfetto.
But we have to shut this off. Okay, done. Okay, now it should be hopefully fine. I hope you can hear me. Good. Sorry, some technical hiccups. Yes, I'm not strictly speaking a grassroots activist, so I will try to introduce just one consideration about the transformation of the relation of social movements towards the political during the COVID-19 crisis. And then I think Luca will have much more information on directly ongoing social practices in Palermo. Luca is from Palermo. I'm just a migrant here. But what I found interesting is this. In my recent, let's say, activist and political life, I was very much engaged in movements that were at the meeting point between social and political activism. For instance, I participated in the foundation of a movement called DiEM25 with the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, and we launched a transnational pan-European movement that eventually ran for elections both at national and at European level in 2019. And I was involved also in some municipal movements, not directly as an actor in those movements, but helping them organize and run for elections, whether that's in Barcelona or in Zagreb, in Croatia, or in Belgrade, in Serbia. And I say this because what we've seen in the recent years has been a transformation of the purely horizontal framework of the 2011 protests, if you remember, the Indignados, Occupy, the Arab Spring, Tahrir Square, into a new form of hybridity that mixed the horizontal and the vertical dimension, or the social and the political dimension. We've seen movements that increasingly took protagonism in directly shaping the political and even electoral game, and in some instances directly running for elections. That was very clear in the new municipalist wave that we've seen in Europe, with social movements, civic platforms running and sometimes winning elections. Barcelona and Comú in Barcelona is one such civic platform that governs and governed the city over the last 5 years. Civic platforms in Madrid, in Zagreb, in Belgrade, in Bologna, in Naples, have organized locally around social issues, sometimes even performing a direct service of substitution for the eroding welfare state, but then also running for elections at the same time in a direct insertion into the political game. This was a widespread phenomenon. You had the transformation of the Indignados in Spain into Podemos, which became a political party that now governs the country in cooperation with the Socialist Party. You had this in close cohabitation between social movements and political parties, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, the relation between Millennium and the Jeremy Corbyn campaign, for example, or in the States, the relation between social activation, especially of a younger generation, and the Bernie Sanders campaign, both the previous and the recent Bernie Sanders campaign. So we come from years in which there has been the identification and the increased responsibility for the political arena on the part of social movements, which is, I suppose, a cyclical wave, because what I'm seeing now in the context of COVID-19, but it precedes it to an extent, is a return to a clearer distinction between the social and the political. Part of it is exogenous to COVID-19. It has to do with some failures and sometimes also victories that might be failures in their victorious result, such as the defeat of the Jeremy Corbyn campaign or the Bernie Sanders campaign, defeat between many inverted commas, because there has been a transformation of common sense, but clearly the attempt to seize political power has been halted. The success, in the case of Spain, of a party emerging from social movements such as Podemos to win government even, but in so doing, to an extent, betraying its origin in the social movements and replicating more traditional structures of decision-making and a more traditional distance between government and civic activation. Also, the municipal wave that was very powerful until a year ago has to some extent subdued. Even Barcelona, which is still run by Ada Colau, it's run in a very different way than the first administration. It's a coalition government. It's much more party political than civic compared to the first run in power that Ada Colau in Barcelona and Comú had. And what it seems to me that we're still witnessing now is, once again, a very powerful social activation from Black Lives Matter to the climate movement, to obviously the feminist movement, although that hasn't changed so much. It's been around, thankfully, for many years now in its power, which has relinquished, perhaps temporarily, I don't know, but has temporarily relinquished this direct connection with political and electoral power. This is probably to do with some contingencies. In the United States, with Biden being the Democratic candidate, there is not much space. In England, with the Labour Party transforming in a post-Corbyn fashion, there is a renormalization of the party political space. There are many reasons also for municipal movements, which are not now worth jumping into. But there has been this detachment. Part of it is exogenous, as I was saying, independent from COVID. Part of it probably has got to do instead with COVID as an accelerator of social tensions, of inequalities, of the need for a very direct reaction that saves lives in more ways than one. Not only in the way, obviously, that is very evident today with Black Lives Matter, but also that saves lives from the effects of misery, which is being reinforced by the effects of COVID-19 and the lockdown, especially in countries with a high percentage of informal economy. And Palermo, to some extent, is somewhere in between the formalized north and the very informal south in this regard. So there is a sense in which lives have to be saved by providing social welfare in a moment of extraordinary pressure on the welfare system. There is a sense in which the state in some countries, and I think Nicosia was mentioning this before, has hardened in its totalitarian derive. And this is true also in Europe, in countries such as Hungary, for example. And there is a need to stand up to a utilization of the COVID-19 emergency on the part of constituted power to limit the spaces for civic action and to shrink the civic space. And this is happening in more countries than one would imagine. Even in countries that used to be at the core of Western liberal democracies, it's happening in the United States. Black Lives Matter is not completely divorced from that totalitarian logic of the state in the form of its military or monopoly of violence that the police represent. And so it's an open question that I pose is just, I suppose, to be conscious of these waves, to be conscious of this transformation of the relation between social activation and the political game into something that is now, to some extent, coming to resemble closer the experience of 2011 than the experience of 2015. And I suppose what's interesting is to see what can be done differently, and I close with this, both in its social and in its potentially political dimension. or in another way, what can be learned from the previous double cycle of social and political that we've inhabited? To what extent, for instance, we can imagine a very concrete action of social movements in the provision of services that save lives, and the experience of Syriza before being Syriza in Greece is a good example of this, providing medicines and food through street kitchens and street pharmacies. To what extent, finally, we can envision a response that is different, perhaps innovative, of the political question, when the political question will begin to be posed, whether in the States that's after the next elections or even during the election campaign, whether that's in potential early elections in many European states. That is to say, how are these movements emerging during COVID-19 going to play the political card differently than the previous phase of politicization of social movements that we have experienced? So these are just some open questions to try and bring this element into the equation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And now we'll move on to actually Jade, if you do not mind. We have our next activist, Jade. She is co-founder and coordinator of the People's Pantry, which is a mutual aid network in Toronto.
Okay. Hello. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, yes. So yes. So my name's Jade. I'm a PhD candidate at York University, and I am a co-founder and coordinator of the People's Pantry. And so what the People's Pantry is basically when COVID hit hard in Canada, a couple graduate students from York University and U of T kind of came together to provide this mutual aid project. And so I'm relatively new to organizing. I started in around 2016 when I moved to the Greater Toronto area to do my PhD. And before this, I was kind of more involved in different kind of things, but mostly local, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color, activisms, and art. And so then kind of where the People's Pantry came from is I think because our origin story kind of encapsulates well our like ethic and what we're doing is we have these caremongering groups. I don't know how familiar people are with the word caremongering, because I recently found out it's more of a Canadian word. So caremongering is just like a word we use to describe a phenomenon that, from what I know, is supposedly started in Toronto, is now specific to Canada. And it's the idea of spreading care and kindness in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think around March, there was this group, a caremongering Facebook group for Toronto. And basically what it was is people would just share things that they needed on the group, and people would offer resources for that, or people would offer resources and then people in the group would access those resources. And one of our founding members, Ellie, and her partner, Yan, posted on the group offering free cooked meals to anyone in Toronto who was in need. And then I saw that and started doing the same thing for Burlington, which is a city that's near Toronto. It's in the Greater Toronto area. And then a few other graduate students who knew Ellie from U of T also started doing that. And then we just kind of like decided to start working together to centralize our efforts. And from that, it's just kind of snowballed into like, so it started with about 7 graduate students. So 6 graduate students, 1 non-graduate student, just kind of cooking food and giving it to people near us. And now it's become something where we have more than 300 volunteers, chef volunteers, delivery volunteers. We have like a location that was donated to us. We've reached over 1,000 families in the Greater Toronto area. And it's like, it's just something that kind of happened through like our works of just basically through our efforts to try to help other people and people in our communities. And so I think actually, because I feel like one of, Caitlin, do you mind if I kind of start to answer your second question? Because I feel like it's already been, your first question. I mean, do you want to actually say it? Because I feel like people have started to answer it and I kind of want to answer it myself.
Oh, sorry, do you mean like what, how are you navigating the constraints around social distancing?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So one of your first questions, and that's the kind of question when I was looking over the program that kind of spoke to me, and I was the first question was like, what does COVID enable or constrain regards to organizing? And the thing is, what struck me about that question is that's a question a lot of people have been asking. Like that's kind of like the go-to question when we're talking about organizing in the pandemic. and like what it means to do activism now. And what I kind of, when I think of that question, I think a better question would actually be, how has COVID been shaped by pre-existing forms of organizing and systems of violence? And so like when I think of it, and specifically what the People's Pantry does is, I guess at our root, we address food insecurity. So we give grocery care packages and cooked meals for free to people in the Greater Toronto Area. And then also neighboring cities in Southern Ontario, basically cities that are close to me. And so we are addressing food insecurity. And the food insecurity is definitely like a COVID thing, right? So like food insecurity came because people who are working paycheck to paycheck lost their jobs or temporarily lost their jobs and couldn't afford food. It also happened because people who are immune compromised in a variety of different ways couldn't leave their house and go to grocery stores. And it also happened because of excessive hoarding, specifically in Toronto, like grocery stores became violent and difficult and like inaccessible in every kind of way. And so like, I think of all that stuff and that's all COVID, right? But then it's also not. So like food insecurity is something that specifically like Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, immigrant communities have been struggling with in Toronto, Canada. That's the context that I can speak about. But in general, for a very long time, these communities are the ones that were working paycheck to paycheck because of systems of racialization and violence that make it more likely that we're going to be working paycheck to paycheck. The people that were hoarding food were predominantly white middle-class people who not only could afford to hoard the food, but were practicing in like an ethic of self-prioritization where they weren't caring about other communities and peoples. And thinking about just like the fact that people living with disabilities and the elderly couldn't, like, it's not new that our society hasn't been able to help those communities that they're not taken seriously and that they're dehumanized, and that also that we have major health infrastructural issues in our health system that weren't able to protect those folks when COVID hit. So like when I think about the need, it's like the need pre-exists COVID. It was just augmented a lot by COVID. And then similarly, the people that are, at least that I can, speak in my immediate milieu of Toronto, the GTA, the people who are kind of responding to it and organizing are people who already had the politic and ethic to do that in the first place. It is primarily women, it's primarily queer and trans folks, it's primarily Black, Indigenous, people of color who come from communities where like supporting our communities and surviving and working together to support one another is a longstanding tradition. And specifically in Toronto, like queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color organizers who are at the forefront of COVID, like have been organizing and doing this kind of organizing since like as far back as the 1960s. Like there is a tradition of organizing that goes way before COVID, and there's a system of violence that goes way before COVID. And so what I think COVID did, it created like a cultural opening where the politic and ethic that these communities already had became more normal in public consciousness. Like, so I think before, when like doing something like mutual aid had more of a negative connotation, where now it's seen as more like it's something that's larger society is promoting and embracing. But the people who, like at least the people I know that are doing this organizing always had that organizing within them. Like they come from a longer tradition of organizing that isn't COVID specific. So like when I think of that question, and it's like, again, a question that I hear constantly, I would just say it's not so much like how COVID has affected activisms. I would just say how have these activisms affected COVID? Because the histories that we're operating from and the like politics we're operating from aren't COVID specific, and we're bringing that to COVID instead of it bringing it to us. So that's it.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Perfect. Okay, so our next, if we could have Luca Cinquemani, also an activist in the Palermo area. If you could also kind of speak about the activism that you're involved in, if it has been, if it is a long-standing form of activism, has it been impacted by COVID? Is it in response to COVID? Who are you serving? That would be great.
Oh. Yeah, sorry for my hair, changing form continuously.
This is COVID.
It's dynamic.
Yes,
it's part of the effect of COVID, I think. Thank you very much. Yes, and I'm Luca Cinquemani, and I'm part of different collectives of activists in Palermo. Can you hear me? Maybe we saw
Lì
some
non-
echo.
Ecco, no, perché lì se no...
Facciamo così.
ovviamente.
Now we can.
One moment, please. Okay. Now, can you hear me? Oh, yes, thank you. I repeat. Okay, I'm Luca Cinquemani. I'm part of different activist collective working in Palermo and not only. And it has been very impressive, the changement of sensibility about colonial past in Europe in these last weeks, as influence of the anti-racial movement in USA. I think in general, the way in which people, activists, artists reacted against the symbols of the European colonial past, in my point of view, has been different, more enthusiastic, more powerful after maybe also for the influence of COVID. In particular, we have seen in Europe, in UK, the attack in Bristol against the slave merchant and the destruction of the statue they throw, as you know, in the harbor of Bristol, also in Belgium. In Italy, we have the colonial question is problematic. Maybe is better I contextualize a bit. We have a terrible colonial past before fascism and during fascism in particular, during the end of 19th century and during the fascism. The colonial past refers to Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya, Greek islands. But if you read a book, a school book about the history, about this colonial period, you maybe can read some lines, but neutral or maybe celebrating the Italian colonial conquest. And this is scandalous. So we start in 2018 with my collective, the name is Fareala, with another collective, Wuming from Bologna, during Manifesta 12 that was in Palermo during that year, to map, starting from Palermo, the colonial places. I remember that the first time we tried to present this research about colonial statues, squares, streets to the people of Manifesta, a person of the public told us, maybe Palermo is not the best city where to look for some colonial street or colonial statue or square, because we have not. 10 days after, we found out like almost 40 colonial places in Palermo. And if we have 40 colonial places, venues in Palermo, you can imagine in Rome, the capital of the fascism, which is full of symbols of colonial and fascist celebration. So we started, our idea was, of course, not to delete the colonial past signs. For us, it was important to re-narrate, to put light about it. For example, I can take an example in particular in a street of Palermo. The name is street Via Magliocco. Vincenzo Magliocco was from Palermo, was the chief of fascist aviation, and he used illegal gases in Ethiopia. Iprite was also illegal in that period, but fascists decided to use on the Ethiopian population. Iprite is a terrible gases that affect skins, and you die very slowly. And so in the city center, we have Via Magliocco still celebrating this terrible fascist in the center of Palermo. So we decided not to delete the name of the street or to substitute it. First of all, we tried to create a big collective with the other association working with migrants, working anti-racist, anti-fascist. For us, it was important to create not a collective, but a collective of collectives. There is to be a lot of people thinking and acting together in a way. And we decided to buy the banner below the name of the street is a is a merchandising banner where you can find the spot for hamburger, wearing, there is something like that. And we put there in a very big, in this very big banner, the picture of Ethiopian people affected by Italian gases, and we changed a bit the name of the Via Magliocco. We remember that he decided with Mussolini to use illegal gases during the fascist aggression of Ethiopia. This has been a previous intervention, and we worked in different colonial places. For us, it was important from the beginning to connect the colonial past to the racism of nowadays. So we made a double mapping of the city. Colonial fascist places, but at the same time, places in which Italian racism and violence affected people coming from other countries. For example, in Via Ernesto Basile, we remembered with a plaque a guy who decided to burn himself because the administration didn't give him the possibility to sell the stuff he was selling. So also violence and racism like that. Because the narration about Palermo in general has been Palermo is very open, it's tolerant, we have no racism. It's not true. Of course we have racism. We have a colonial and fascist past, and we are a continuation of this. So we have a lot of fascism in our behavior. We have a lot of micro-fascism. We have to be able to recognize, to deconstruct, and better to do it individually, but better collectively. So for us, has been an activist movement, but also an autocritic movement to find the sign of colonialism and fascism and patriarchy in our behavior. After the lockdown, and after the USA movement, as you know, a wave of sensibility about European colonial past started. For us, has been a very enthusiastic moment because we have been working about it for like 2 years. And now the problem of the colonial status, fascist status, racist status became a wide problem. In particular, this discussion in Italy crystallized in a figure, Indro Montanelli. Indro Montanelli was a journalist. There is a statue and a garden with the name of Indro Montanelli in Milano. Last year, a collective of feminists attacked the statue of Montanelli, putting pink color on the statue. Maybe you know this intervention. Maybe Francesca we can find it. And meanwhile, Francesca look for it. I explain to you a bit who was Montanelli. Montanelli was a journalist. Is considered like the father of journalism, a very important reference for journalism in Italy. During fascism, he went to Ethiopia inside the military structure. During this period, Montanelli was very close to fascism and part of the military fascist troops. And during that period, he bought a 12-year-old girl, Desta, and he, during the interview after this fact, because a lot of people asked to him, how do you think about your relationship with your marriage with a 12-year-old Eritrean girl? And he never admitted the violence, because with a very patriarchal fascist point of view, he told in Africa, this is normal. First, simplification in Africa in general, and this is normal. And also, theoretician, people who make a lot of theory about colonialism in Italy, like Angelo Del Boca, who has been maybe the first pioneer about looking for the Italian crimes. He took a position very strange during this last week. He told the marriage between Montanelli and the young girl in Eritrea has been an act of integration. and fraternization between people. So it's very terrible to understand that also the scientific eye will have to decolonize it, because Del Boca, if it's justifying it, is in another way, but maybe he is not aware, is justifying the use of the body of the woman as a good for exchange, the fraternization between men. So this is very terrible. So a lot of polemic, a lot of discussion in Italy started. So we decided also in Palermo to give a voice about this querelle, this discussion about the defense of Montanelli or not. For us in particular, Montanelli is an emblematic figure of the fascist patriarchal culture we still have in Italy. And we decided to take an interview of Montanelli in which he started to talk about sexual particular stuff, about the relationship with the star. We found for the first time the face of the star, because the star inside this narration has been only the 12 years old girl, so Montanelli was in the center. So we found yes, Francesca is going to show you the intervention we made in Palermo. Yes, this one. Yes, in Montanelli is we took there is the artist activist we supported. The name are Mr. Chance, Betty Macaluso, and Ulrike H. They retake a terrible part of interview of Montanelli, in which he says, like, in tropical countries this is normal. With 12 years old, it's normal. A girl is already a woman, and this was normal. So it totally justifying his position. Still in 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000, Montanelli still justifying the colonial violence and his position. And we found a picture of the star. You can see on the left. And at the same time, we renamed the Via Montanelli in Palermo with Via the Star. So we retake the subaltern person in this history, and we decided in a way to symbolically delete Montanelli. For us was a way to feed the discussion. Of course, we don't want to delete Montanelli Street to poor. Of course, I don't want to have a Montanelli Street in Palermo, but we think it's necessary to continue the discussion, because thanks to this flame about Montanelli, a lot of patriarchal and fascist position of people, artists, intellectuals in Italy, you don't imagine they were fascist or colonialist and patriarchal, they totally are, because they are defending Montanelli and the colonial positions. In fact, this murales in the city center has been attacked like 2 days after. Francesca maybe can show the fascist attack we had. Yes, I try to translate. They put like satanic symbol, and they put shit artists. And this is normal, of course. We have to admit we have a lot of fascist parts which are defending Montanelli. And I think the Montanelli question is touching a very hidden part of the patriarchal and colonial culture. Because if I talk with a person defending Montanelli, they say, but you are decontextualizing. It was normal in Africa in the period when it is still normal. And Italian colonialism has been not so terrible. This is a myth, an auto-representation, which has a name. Italians, good people. Italiani, brava gente. This is the stereotypical sentence we use to justify and to hidden our terrible colonial past. So for us, it's important to feed the discussion about it, because I think, and my collective thinks at last, that if we don't talk about colonialism and we don't face this terrible period, we don't understand and we don't recognize our patriarchal part and racist part. Because there is a fil rouge, a connection between that historical period and this historical period. The violence against other countries then is the same violence against people coming from the other part of the Mediterranean as migrants here in Sicily, in Italy, and in Europe. So I think COVID pushed this sensibility and critical sensibility against see signs of European colonialism. Sorry, maybe I've been too long. Immagino non sento niente. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I'm thinking, yeah, I've noticed a couple of people left, so I'm wondering if maybe it's you're pressed for time a little bit. It might be a good opportunity to open it up for open discussion right now. So based on what we've heard so far, and people's experiences, based on people's experiences engaging in activism at this point, I'm wondering if we can maybe talk about in a more open discussion, like kind of how people understand possibilities right now for organization, things that constraints that you can understand having to mobilize around, possibilities for the future. And one of the things after that, oh, sorry, I'm getting a double speak now. Is that me? Okay. And so one of the specific, I guess, questions I had, especially in relation to BLM and COVID in general, is the idea and the problem and the use of imagery. So maybe what I'll try to do is screen share as well, because one of the things that has kind of propelled a lot of activism that we see on the streets has been propelled and mobilized around images, especially for Black Lives Matter and for COVID-related activism as well. So kind of the violence that we see enacted on other bodies, as well as the violence of the virus, that kind of violence being shown through images has been useful in some senses, but at the same time too, how do we have to respect using these kinds of images? Do we disrespect those people by reducing their lives to that one violent moment? So I'll show you some of these images. Okay. Wait, how can I do this? Okay. So if I wait. I'm just trying to okay, sorry, Francesca, I don't have access to do that, but probably what I'll do is I'll just describe. So maybe what I'll do, actually, Francesca, is it possible that you could share from your side? Anyway, so basically what I'm interested in about is, like, in terms of tactics for mobilization, and like Jade's talked a lot about that as well. Perfecto. So if you look at the first picture, you can see, so this is an image. So basically, one of the things that was said initially in relation to activism around COVID was basically the inappropriateness of sharing images related to people's death. I remember that this was something that came up a lot on social media in Italy, in relation to Italy, like the lack of respect that came with sharing images of people's last moments. And of course, this is something that has always been happening in terms of the impoverishment and disease that's happens in countries in Africa and the Middle East. But it's only when it happened in Italy did people recognize that as something that was inappropriate, right? And so is this maybe a question, this is also a question of recognizing how can we, people's inability to sometimes recognize humanity in racialized people and in people living in developing countries. But then the question then becomes, how can we use imagery to effectively mobilize people while still respecting people's humanity, especially because it has become so important for people to now recognize the seriousness of racial violence and the seriousness of like the strength of the virus, basically. So Francesca, could you go to the next slide? Perfect. Okay, so this is something, for example, this is something that's happening, this happened in Brazil. If you're not familiar, Bolsonaro, leader of that country, has handled COVID about as well as Trump has. And so this is a form of activism that they've undertaken. So these are mass grave sites dug on a beach in Brazil to demonstrate like basically the mass atrocities that are happening in this country because of the Bolsonaro's lack of action. And so this could be something like this kind of imagery could be something useful for mobilizing people in the face of a pandemic. And so in this sense, do we need bodies on the streets if we can use this type of, if we can use this kind of alternative? Would you be able to go to the next picture? If possible? Thank you. Awesome. And the same thing with Black Lives Matter. So what kind of images do we want to share in order to mobilize people around issues such as systemic racial violence in the country? Do we show like things like issues of kind of images of empowerment, or do we need to show issues of violence? Images of violence in order to effectively mobilize people around these kinds of issues. And so I guess this is my question for you in terms of how do we mobilize people, especially when people are largely relegated to their homes now, supposedly. Oftentimes imagery can become a very powerful thing, especially because it's something that can be so easily shared on social media. So what does it mean, especially, so this is a question that relates back to the main question. How do you understand in your activist practices, and in general, if you're not directly an activist, the use of imagery in terms of mobilizing people around issues, around important issues like these? What do we have to respect? What do we have to be careful of? What's inappropriate, I suppose? So that's my question. And we don't need to screen share if you don't want anymore. Perfect.
Leslie, do you want to react?
I think Jade had her hand up as well. Yeah.
So yeah, when I was looking at that question, it's because I wouldn't have thought about the role of images before reading the question. I think in large part because I wasn't really entrenched in the Twitter sphere and like that aspect at the beginning of the pandemic, which was a big part of it. But when I was like kind of thinking about it, I do think images can be very powerful, like images of empowerment and mobilization, and like just thinking about the People's Pantry as us sharing food and like the photos that our chefs make and the photos of the food that our chefs make and share with people as a part of mutual aid, that has a powerful effect. The photos of the rally, so we had a rally, Not Another Black Life had a rally in Toronto that showed photos of just like thousands of people. I think that can have a powerful effect. But when thinking about death, it's like, I don't need to see a guy a black man not suffocate for 8 minutes to know that death is like a reality for Black and non-white communities. Like, I don't need to see mass graves to know that death is a reality for people who aren't supported by the healthcare system. Like, death is normal to people who contend with the fact that like death is a natural part of a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, colonialist society. Like, death is just there and present, and if you don't contend with that, it's usually because of privilege. And so like those images of death, I don't know if they mobilize people who are aware of the violence of just like everyday, like death is mundane, it's not spectacular. And I think images or videos of certain deaths can make death feel spectacular, and it's not, it's a systemic thing that happens every single day to people. And I think that what the effect of that is that it can make it seem beyond you. So even thinking about the Black Lives Movement, it's like, I think particularly a lot of white folks, but also like non-Black people of color, like see those images and think like, okay, like that's not me. It's not, I'm not responsible. I'm not located. This is surreal. This isn't something that I have to use to reflect on my own life. And I think even looking at like the deaths with COVID in places like Italy, I think a lot of places, even in Canada, it's people didn't actually think COVID was really real in a lot of ways. And you still see that. There's a lot of like, I'm from like London, Ontario. It's more of like an rural city. and the anti-shutdown, anti-mask, like COVID's all fake is really big there. Like they don't believe it. And so I think art and photos by people from marginalized communities, from Black, Indigenous people of color, from the communities affected, and not photos that are taken by people co-opting them. Those things can be powerful. Those can be powerful images, but I don't know if images of death are motivating. And when they do motivate people, again, thinking of Black life, like the Black Lives Matter movement, which I would say is the other pandemic we are currently now talking about, is a lot of like, yeah, again, white folks got mobilized by that, but did they? Like, didn't they just kind of post on social media for 5 minutes and then do actual activism, but then burn out immediately because they didn't know how? Like, did it actually ignite legitimate, like long-term solidarity work? Or did it just make it feel like the spectacular moment in time that was removed from the systems of racial, colonial, patriarchal violence that make state violence possible, then also make COVID possible? Like, so I don't know. I'm not for photos of death, I think, as a mobilizing factor. I don't know if it can be. So that's it. I'm done again.
Yeah. Sorry, Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I guess it depends in my mind, what is the movement trying to do? Right, like, and the other thing I would say, and of course, photo images get attention, and they do become something that people share to connect to one another. I think thinking about images in this moment or video footage, I think in my mind it makes it, if I think, okay, so the role of like online and offline is different right now than it normally is. And so the role of images is different because we are spending, we're more dependent on shared information online. We would normally be able to kind of exist in the world and have a more diverse set of inputs. So this isn't gonna like be super coherent, but I'm like, so therefore, we're more dependent on online, and therefore images are more important, and images of death are mobilizing people, but we don't necessarily have the trust, as I think, to kind of keep things beyond that initial outburst. But I think, it probably, it does depend on where you are, what the images are. But I mean, there's this thing like Lance Bennett talks about the logic of connective action as opposed to the logic of collective action. And connective action is more individualized and about sharing as an individual and your networks rather than groups. One of the things that we're seeing right now is that we're seeing movements that are less dependent on groups, even though people's political histories in groups are playing out and groups are able to manifest particular forms of action. But the kind of balance between groups and individual mobilization is changed. So we have people getting, seeing these images through their networks and saying, I'm going to do something. I mean, that's one of the things, like, I'll just stop there.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point, though. It is true now. We're kind of many of us are just cloistered in our homes. And then what gets us out the door or online doing something is images that resonate with us or make us feel something. Yeah. But it's a good point too, Jade. Like you empower, maybe like action comes through feelings of empowerment rather than fear, in a sense. Like I'm just thinking about a lot of the images you find, like a lot of the images that People's Pantry shares are very mobilizing, like in an empowering sense. Like even the images you put online today were about a step-by-step program of how to get people to set up their own mutual aid network, rather than like trying to appeal to people through fear, which is a really good point. Rosa, you had a comment?
I do, and thank you. Hello to everyone. Leslie, earlier you talked about the different chapters or phases within COVID in terms of organizing. And the first one that you mentioned was, we were in this lockdown survival mode. And I think when we're in that sort of space, things get very desperate and we're all looking for meaning, social meaning as to what's happening, why is this happening, what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my family and friends and so on, and the community that I live in. So people were, I think, very desperately looking for answers. And one of the things that I observed early on is or was an onslaught of images. And of course, when we think of social media, all the social media platforms, the image, the social image reigns supreme. And so early on in all this COVID phenomenon, the images seem to be about, and the stories that were being told seem to be a part of this conspiracy theories, trying to understand where did this virus come from. And many of those were, well, in fact, all of them were xenophobic, racist, pointing the finger to the markets in Wuhan, those dirty Chinese, and so forth. And so I think, there's a lag between, people want, sometimes there's a lag, I think, where academics, when we speak, we want data, reliable data from which we can speak. And so, but people, the lay people, want answers. And I think there's a vacuum that sometimes is created, and conspiracy theories often fill that vacuum, especially on platforms like social media. So for me, social media took on a very interesting shape and form during COVID, and it mobilized the wrong sentiment in many ways, and seemed to, because I don't know about you guys, but I got, from perfectly wonderful people, I got incredible messages about, well, gee, Rosa, if you want to know what's going on, this is what's happening. It's coming from China. And people had a very hard time discerning, the criteria that we use to qualify our data sources seem to, be out the window, so to speak. They were wanting to, they're searching for some sort of meaning. And so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, replete with xenophobic commentary regarding the Chinese people, the country, and so on. So that was one of the things that I observed very early on.
No, that's a really good point, Rosa. I wonder too, the fact that I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, so it's hard for me to understand why people decide to turn to specific narratives over others. I do wonder, fear makes people, it becomes a simplistic narrative that people can rely on to alleviate some of their fears to a certain extent. But it's hard to know. But you're right, there's a lot of really disparate narratives that are very xenophobic, very racist, and obviously very problematic, because it prevents people from mobilizing with their communities, and then of course even further marginalizing specific racialized people who are even more likely to experience discrimination. So really problematic.
I'm wondering how is that played out in Italy in terms of, I know there's been a real struggle around immigration and securitization over the last, 8 years, 10 years, right? And has the right been using that as well? Using COVID.
Leslie, is that a general question, or are you?
Yeah, it was a general question too. Like, I'm just like, what's the word on the street in Italy?
Well, from my perspective, sitting in St. Catharines, Ontario, and from, through my connections to the people I know in Italy, I think that script has played out very nicely for those on the right. I think it's been used as a justification for, it's those dirty others, those barbarians that are bringing that virus to our country, right? And I think COVID has played into that very much so.
I went to a session in Firenze last year, and it was a discussion about how social movements were now doing the work of NGOs, and NGOs were now doing the work of social movements because of the way that migration had become criminalized. So, and people helping migrants had become criminalized. So you had activists who are now providing mutual aid and food and medicine, et cetera, and you had like development agencies lobbying the government and protesting. So, and I was like, oh, and now you add COVID to that. So that's just sort of the background of my question.
I wonder, it'd be interesting to hear. I don't know whose background. Does anyone have their television on? It's interesting, because I think everyone's muted. Francesca.
Hey,
Oh.
Kate. Yes, here I am.
I was just wondering.
I wanted to, with Luca, we wanted to share the interview of Montanelli, to Montanelli.
Yes, there is this interview in
Yeah, let's change the mic.
Yeah, for sure. Can I just ask a question? Because Leslie had a good question about kind of securitization practices in Italy, and I was wondering if one of you would be able to answer that.
yes. Okay. About securitarian policies, I think the situation was already a disaster before COVID, and I don't think we found a way to find a solution about it. I think COVID, of course, the pandemic, securitarian state of emergency, as Agamben and before Benjamin knows, it has been radicalized. So, of course, the COVID pandemic and the excuse to protect from COVID is a way to make more radical and more difficult, more deep the securitarian policies on us. And of course, about also other limitation of freedom. COVID has been, it opened a space of opportunity through the state of emergency to take off a lot of freedom through surveillance, control, digital control. I don't know the way, if there are possibility practices to fight against it, because I think we are all part of the system. We are using iPhone, geolocalization, continuously we feed a lot of data, but this is a general problem, I think. But I can't see any other solution than radical ludism to escape it. If we are inside the machine, it's very difficult to escape. As Agamben told, it's very ingenious point of view to stay inside the medium and to have the pretension to use it in a good way. If you are inside this box, you will be controlled. Okay, now we can, this is my point of view. I'm very radical. Of course, we can reflect, we have to be critical, but it's very difficult to fight against it, to fight and to find a solution to, because as the laws told, in the future, a lot of liberation, there will be together oppression. So it will be very difficult to recognize the oppression, because it will have the face of the liberation, the appearance of the liberation. So nowadays, it's very difficult to understand if something will oppress you or will free you. And maybe when it's freeing you, it's oppressing you in a way that is controlling you.
Luca, can I ask you,
you want to talk, you use your voice, and in that moment, you are creating like a data archive for your process in 20 years. Okay. Sorry for the dystopic point of view. Now we are introducing changing topic, coming back to colonialism. And
Luca, can I ask you a quick question first before we move on? Would you, hello? Luca?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah. I'm wondering what your opinion is on this. Would you not agree that people like Giorgia Meloni has used COVID as a way to weaponize this whole securitization issue in Italy, and as a way to push her agenda forward in terms of getting Italy to exit the European Union?
Praticamente se Giorgia Meloni ha strumentalizzato la situazione.
Cioè la Meloni non ha usato la sua politica per avanzare dei suoi punti, cioè per uscire dall'Italia.
Sì, ma io penso...
uscire dall'Unione Europea, scusa.
Come?
Sì, per exit, per uscire.
Capito?
Certamente le destre hanno trovato, sorry, maybe wing right, they found a good ground to continue their fascist politics in this period. With the state of emergency, the possibility, of course, to use the social, also the stabilization with the raising of the injustice, and to use their rhetoric in a more fascist direction. So yes, I think, yes, in a way, COVID created totally a new ground of possibilities. And for that, I think we have to take this ground of possibility to stay together, think together, and to imagine what you said at the start of the meeting, to imagine a new world. Because I think still is possible. I want to be optimist. I think still is possible. And if we are here discussing, I think there is hope, and the hope will be a collective hope. Because if we are alone, it's very difficult. Also, this separation of the bodies, we are using Zoom, of course, the only way to do it in this moment. We are separated, there is no proximity of bodies, which is very important revolutionary point, I think, but it's the only way. So we have to continue in this very difficult season of our story. Human period. And if you have no new answer, I can introduce the interview. If you are...
We can wrap up. We can wrap up with this video.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea.
It's a video of an interview of Montanelli during a television interview from the journalist Biasic. In the public area, there were Elvira Banotti, a very strong feminist who interrupted Montanelli and destroy him in a way. There are subtitles below, so you can read. It's very short. I checked if there are the subtitles, but I think that on...
No, let's take the one with the subtitles.
Yes, you can find on Facebook.
Yeah, I will find it.
One moment. It's very important because Elvira Banotti point very important point. Yes, maybe YouTube. Put yes, Banotti subtitles. I think this one. Okay, good.
Let's see.
Devi attivarli, guarda, c'è l'icona.
Okay, we can activate the subtitles.
So,
In italiano.
oui,
Non è che seguivano la banda, ma ogni volta
In italiano,
non ho mai capito come facesse.
Oh, amazing. Yes. You know, if we're having a hard time finding a video with appropriate subtitles, it might be just appropriate we can send a link out later, and then we can maybe just finish up now if that works for people, because we're almost at 2 hours, actually 1:45. If we can't find a video. Actually, and Eunice, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. This might be actually a good opportunity for you to, you'd mentioned you wanted to give a comment about practical action. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name, but
Judas, it's fine. So I would like to make one point for in relationship to activism and COVID, and how people actually can take direct action to defend themselves and improve their chances against the COVID-19. So first, I'm going to a little bit technical detail of COVID-19. So most people actually die of the cytokine storm. That's a reaction to the COVID-19. That's an autoimmune inflammation system. And this is being undermined by the moment you already have different comorbidities, inflammation, or an affected immune system. And we see this mostly also among migrants, blacks, indigenous, and people of colors, this kind of health injustice. But it's just not only because of socioeconomic conditions. What we really need to realize that one of the biggest contributors to this is a lack of vitamin D. And recent studies in the University of Turin have showcased the relationship between vitamin D levels in the body and the chances of getting well through the coronavirus. And you make vitamin D, as most people know, by getting sunlight. But the more pigment you have in your skin, the less the less vitamin D you make. So, and here we come up with several injustices that are related to this. So it's based on internalized racism, because a lot of migrant communities, they don't want to get a tan. They feel there's still white supremacy, and having a tan is being looked down upon. It's sexism of wearing the veil and not being able to expose your skin to the sunlight. It's domestic incarceration of people of color, lack of sunlight. You get the same amount of daily access to the sun as white people. And the general lockdown, which affects more migrant communities because they have no balconies, no outside areas, and they don't have access to the sun. So if you know anybody with color, either give them vitamin D or tell them how important it is to get into the sun. And with this, you are capable of really saving lives on the most practical conditions. That's it.
very practical. Thank you. With that being said, it seems like we're having technical difficulties to a certain extent, and we are almost at 2 hours. I really appreciate everyone who stayed for this long. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again, Leslie, for coming and sharing your interpretation and your story. That was
very much. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It was a fantastic debate, and I hope we will see each other soon, virtually and physically. So thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Ciao.
Ciao.